Well, I think we are right at 5:30. We are going to go ahead and jump right in. Um, as a reminder, for those that are in attendance this evening live, this webinar is being recorded, so we'll have this available for future reference. We'll also be providing the link in our regular board director updates that we'll post this video on Vimeo. So with that, we'll just go ahead and jump right into this month's webinar. First off, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining this week's session on building better communities, navigating architectural reviews and community standards enforcement. By the way, my name is Brian Stewart, and I have the pleasure of serving as the branch president of Associate McKay Management here in Birmingham, Alabama, serving communities and associations all across the state of Alabama. So again, I'm here to host this webinar, share some information, have an open discussion Q&A session at the end of the session. We'll definitely keep the session to an hour or less this evening. So again, thank you all who have joined or taking time to listen to this on a replay after the live event. I mentioned the recording is being, or the presentation is being recorded. This is our third session in our board director education series, a series of free webinars we're putting on as Associate McKay Management, really with the desire and intent to help educate and inform current board members and communities that are partner, as well as maybe potential future communities and board members that might benefit from our community management services. Really to give you an idea of the roles of both board members, developers in some cases, homeowner associations, and us as the association management company, and more specifically, the role of the community association manager in many cases. So our agenda for today, we'll start out by talking about architectural reviews, and then we'll jump to community standards enforcement. And then, as I mentioned earlier, we'll have some time for questions and answers and open discussion among board members or clients that might be on the call this evening. So before we jump in, I just want to take a quick look at what I hope you walk away with today. But by the end of the session, this hour of review, I hope you have the ability to clearly explain why architectural reviews matter, how to ensure your process is not only compliant, but also fair and transparent for those in your community. We'll talk about what best practices look like from documentation to communication, and how to avoid the kind of decisions that might lead to conflict or even legal challenges down the road. We'll also spend some time unpacking community standards enforcement. We've recently changed that term from compliance to community standards enforcement, and we'll talk about that later, about why we made that shift and why we think that's important, that language matters. It's really not just about issuing violations. It's about building systems that are consistent, empathetic, and defensible, whether you're dealing with holiday decorations or chronic landscaping issues. I hope that you'll leave with some practical tools and ideas about things that you can apply immediately to your community to strengthen the trust and improve all aspects and outcomes in your community. So I hope that sounds good. With that, we're going to dive right in. So why do these topics matter? I think these two topics are two of the main things that are most sensitive and visible responsibilities for HOAs. And as you can see, if they're done well, they help to build trust and add value or protect value for your communities, the value of your homes and your communities. And if they're done poorly, as you might have already experienced as a board member, these can create conflict at the very least, and at the very worst, can really ramp up your legal risk and potential exposure for litigation around these issues if not done well. So first, let's talk about architectural reviews. As you might imagine, one of the big benefits of living in a community that has a homeowners association is the maintenance of standards of appearance, curb appeal, the cohesive aesthetic that's often thanks to straightforward guidelines that regulate the review process for what homeowners can or can't do with their home or with their landscaping, etc. So that's why this is really important. So briefly, some of the purposes of architectural reviews, as you see, primarily to protect and increase property values, ensure uniformity and visual harmony. In some communities, this is more important than others. Some communities, it's very strict about exactly what color you can paint your home, what type or what color your shutters might be, how you might be able to paint your fence. So there's a wide spectrum of how that gets applied. But ultimately, it's about ensuring that you don't have neighbors that are true anomalies that are driving down the homeowner values in your community. Also about ensuring safety, not having cars parked on the street or basketball goals in the street or things that might present a safety hazard for the community. And then really helping to prevent some disputes, promote community cohesion, not having a neighbor that might have trash or furniture on their front porch or their Christmas lights up 365 days a year, things like that. And then really they should be about reinforcing your governing documents. We covered governing documents in our first webinar series, really like Board 101, what are governing documents, including what's commonly referred to as CC&Rs, or as you see, their covenants, conditions, and restrictions, essentially a legal document that spells out the details of what is allowed or not allowed in your community, in addition to what may be contained in your community bylaws, or some communities even have design guidelines or specifics around this particular area that lays out very specific details, what's allowed, what's not, what's required as part of an ARC submission for approval that we'll talk about in just a bit. Ultimately, it's important to know this really isn't about control. It's really about community stewardship and ensuring that everybody is getting the benefit of having all of these things as a paying member of the HOA. So a couple of tricks on and tips on how to organize your HOA ARC process, and that's Architectural Review Committee is the common acronym ARC stands for. So number one, establish guidelines. If they don't already exist, you should begin by defining your HOA's architectural guidelines in as much detail as possible. Really thinking through what are your community's visual goals, your standards, and the purpose and architecture of the review framework. And then detail the changes requiring authorization and confirm that they're being consistent with your association bylaws and CC&Rs. And then you have a consistent process to vet and approve those submissions, as well as have, we'll get into in a minute, an appeal process if needed, depending on the disposition of the initial ARC request. The second thing is, if you don't have an architectural review committee, that is a best practice to have, whether it's 3 or 4 or 5 members of your community who may or may not be serving on the board. Generally recommend they probably not be board members, but community members who have a passion or an interest in serving in this regard. In some communities, we as Associate McKay Management more or less act as the ARC review committee, following the bylaws and the CC&Rs for community. And essentially, if a homeowner's request matches those, then we approve the request all the way. We have some other communities where the ARC review committees are very active, and they review in detail every single request that gets submitted and approves or denies and works with homeowners on those submissions as well, and sort of everything in between. And then really it's all about helping to manage the application process. I'll touch on this briefly during the presentation. For some of you, I know some of you are current community members of Associate McKay Management, what we're doing to improve all of these things ourselves to provide better value and service for all of you as our board members and communities. And ultimately, it's about enforcing the guidelines and standards. The most important thing there is being consistent, not having a subjective process, but being very objective about what the requirements are. Does the submission match or not match the HOA guidelines and bylaws, etc.
Hey, Brian, this is Jeff Ray with
Hey,
Blue
Jeff.
Water Park. Hey, how are you?
Great. Good to hear you.
Yeah. Mind if I chime in right here?
Absolutely. Please.
So first of all, I missed session 2, but I really appreciate you guys doing these informative sessions for us.
Thank you.
Session 1 was really beneficial. Session 2, or excuse me, session 3 already is being beneficial to me.
Okay,
So
good.
I appreciate you guys doing this, number one. I had talked to Tristan about the application process for the ARC,
Yeah.
and we have really one issue ongoing here within our community. And what I noticed in at least our ARC submittal and an approval form is there is not a committed completion date or an expected completion date post start. And
Yeah.
those could be two different things. And so I don't know if we're using a standard Associate McKay form or if it's unique to our community. If it's unique to our community, we could change it rather easily,
Sure.
but it might be beneficial to have as part of that submittal a commitment for a completion date, or at least a commitment for a completion date X number of days or months post start. Does that make sense?
It does. Great point. And our question, I think for our new process, that's definitely part of it. And I also know in some associations, there's language in their CCNRs about that. Once project is approved, there's a certain time frame before the project must be completed. But we'll definitely note that and review our process that we're going to be rolling out through Town Square. I believe I'm 99% sure that's part of that, but I'll verify that so it's good feedback nonetheless. Because I do know even in your community where you've had things that were approved and then year or two goes by and they haven't started or haven't completed, and that can be an issue. So it's better to define that well up front.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
So
you.
yeah, our documents say, and I think they're really geared towards new construction. So
Yeah.
from the time you start till the time you complete is 12 months. But that doesn't really seem to be realistic if we're talking about planting trees or removing
Yeah.
trees or things of
Putting in a
that nature.
fence or
So
yeah, a new roof or something for sure.
yeah. So I just ask you guys to take a look at that. And if it's something
Okay.
that we can do uniquely within our community, we'll go do that.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah. Talking about architectural guidelines here, as you see there, as I mentioned, they're usually in the governing documents. So what we were just talking about, and the more detailed, the better. Some we've seen are very generic and very almost vague. Really, it's kind of up to the committee to decide, and others are very, very, very prescriptive with a lot of detail and detailed lists of specifications of material types, colors, even in some cases, vendors that you can choose from, etc. But just if folks aren't familiar on the call, some things that might be covered would be, landscaping issues. If you want to redo the landscaping in your yard, or you want to cut down a tree that might be a larger tree, things like that. Certainly, house color paints, fencing is another one that we see a lot of requests for. Roofing replacement, window replacement, things like that. Just general things that should be or could be covered in the ARC guidelines. A little more detail on the committee. Certainly, as I mentioned, should be community members in good standing, meaning folks that have paid up on their assessments and have some potential background, if possible, on that might be useful for serving this committee. Maybe even some training, and certainly we can provide that. An ARC committee specific, sort of one-on-one, a refresher, certainly around, as we'll get into later, the ins and outs of Town Square, how to review applications, how to vote on Town Square, etc. Then maybe how to think through if there are issues that maybe aren't covered in the guidelines, how to handle that, or even the appeal process for the board as well. Ultimately, it's really trying to balance, what homeowners want to do with their homes, not squashing individual expression or creativity, but really preserving the community's appeal and property values. Again, not having someone that's painting their home neon green or that has, two vehicles in the yard, et cetera, things like that. And I think the other key thing for the committee is just being very transparent and avoiding any conflicts of interest, particularly why we generally recommend not having a board member, be on the ARC committee, so that, all the decisions are transparent and essentially a board member doesn't get any differential treatment than another community member might. So the role of the ARC, or the Architectural Review Committee, obviously to review the architectural review request, enforce the standards that are outlined in your bylaws or your CCNRs, assessing compliance, maybe to a lesser degree, but even after someone has completed the project, did they complete it as they had submitted, or did they submit something and then they actually didn't follow what they submitted? It's a different color, or it's the fence isn't where they said it was going to be, or the shed is a different type than what they submitted, things like that. Kind of inspecting what was expected. Certainly in approving or denying requests that get submitted. Another really, really important thing is the documentation of the process and the outcomes, meaning what was submitted when, who was it reviewed by, and then ultimately what was the disposition? Was it approved or denied, or denied with conditions, or denied with, hey, it's approved conditionally once you receive your building permits from the city, or when you receive some other documentation or quote from a vendor or things like that. And then the other key thing is just communication. And these are all things also in full transparency that we as a management company are working to continue to enhance, to make all these things easier, faster, more transparent, and clear for everybody involved in the process.
Brian.
Let's move on here. Some discussion about ARC authority. What can or can't they do? Certainly varies by community. Again, how large the community might be, or how many requests come in on a regular basis. Certainly, some of that should be outlined or informed by the board and/or what's in the governing documents. When in doubt, we would always recommend, getting guidance from your association attorney, or certainly attorneys that we have in our network that could give good advice, that do HOA governance and legal matters for a living, that could give you good guidance on sort of what are the boundaries, even if it's about a particular issue that may not be well defined in the governing documents or the CC&Rs, how the association might want to handle those one-off or specific questions or issues. So a few things around the review process. Hey, I want to put in a new fence. I'm a homeowner. What do I need to do? Where do I need to send it? How long is it going to take to get approved? That sort of thing. So this is where we're also working to enhance our communication process to make sure that the submission requirements are well known. Even so, including on the form, depending on what kind of project you're requesting or submitting for approval for, as much detail as possible is listed. So there's really no question. And even in some of the technology building the submission form, I'm sure you're all familiar, such that if you're the person requesting it, if you don't submit the required documentation, you can't move forward in the process and you can't complete the submission, which helps to avoid, a homeowner submitting an application that may not be complete or that doesn't have all the required documents. Then it avoids the back and forth with emails or other communication, versus just making sure that everything that's required is submitted the first time, so that it can go through a rapid and thorough review and get the approval that the homeowner may be looking for up front. Certainly the evaluation criteria are important. As I mentioned, you want to have as much of that be purely objective versus anything subjective. Now, granted, there are some things that may require some nuance or some subjective discussion, particularly if they're not well articulated in the governing documents. But generally speaking, the more objective, the better. And then timely responses. And I guess this is in the eye of the beholder. If you're the homeowner and you're wanting to put a fence because you just got a new puppy, hey, time is of the essence. I need this approved like right now, versus putting that in the process for the ARC committee, how often they're able to meet, or in some communities where the ARC review might still be with the developer, and then this is just one task out of many for them. So I think generally trying to define that in the governing documents and setting the expectation up front, even within the review submission documents, what the expected review time is, so that the homeowner doesn't submit it and then 2 days later is calling or emailing saying, what's the status of my ARC request, when it clearly articulates it, takes anywhere from 10 business days to 60 days, depending on the community, for review and approval. And then the other important thing is documenting things all along the way. I think one of the benefits we'll talk about with our Town Square application is all that documentation is, I would say, very automated and is archived very well. So there's really not a lot of risk of losing documentation or not being able to go back and say something that was submitted 2 years ago, finding that application and all the supporting documents very easily for any community whenever that might be required. Some common pitfalls that we see in some cases pretty regularly is a selective enforcement of community standards or lack of documentation. I think some of that will be obviated by using Town Square, because again, as part of the submission process, if you don't sort of check all the boxes and submit all the required documentation, you can't really move forward with the submission. So some of the nuts and bolts of this is just the request submission, and then the application and documentation review. Again, whether that's with our internal team at Associate McKay, whether it's the community manager, or we have an awesome colleague, Kelly Reading, who handles all of the ARC submissions for our organization, or whether it's the ARC review committee, or whether it's just a particular board member, or whether it's a developer, but basically articulating and outlining really clearly who's going to do what and when. And then having the committee decision, whether again that's us or whether that's a group, say, hey, this is either approved or denied, or as I mentioned, maybe approved with conditions. And then ultimately providing a written notification to the owner, a letter that spells out, specifically, yes, your ARC request is approved or it was denied. And importantly, some indication of why it was denied, not just, bureaucrat stamp denied and you have no idea, but denied either lacked documentation or wasn't in compliance with the governing documents, or you didn't submit all the required information, whatever the reason might be, so that the homeowner knows it wasn't just an arbitrary decision, but they know what they might need to go back and obtain or fix to resubmit or file an appeal, if they want to do that. And then I think this is an area where we can also enhance. We don't see a lot of this. I think for most of the ARC reviews that we get, they're relatively straightforward for common things that we mentioned, like fences or painting or landscape changes. But with things that don't really fit squarely into one of the defined buckets of those documents is maybe where you get into an appeal, or where there's just a difference of opinion about what the documents say. But nonetheless, having a really clear and well-documented appeal process. And then potentially if the ARC committee has, say denied a request and articulated the reason, sometimes the board can review those and overturn the decisions of the ARC committee. Again, as long as there's good rationale and good documentation. Maybe there were things that the ARC committee had not considered or were not aware of when the submission was denied, etc. The main point is just having good documentation and a good process that's clear and remains objective and professional for everyone involved. And this is probably true for everything in life, but communication is key in updating folks along the way. I think the other value of migrating everything to Town Square is having a clear visibility of where everything is at in the process, when it was submitted, who it's waiting on, whether it's us or a board member or an ARC committee, or we're waiting on more documentation. We have clear line of sight as to kind of where things are at. And you can update a homeowner or a board on that you have 10 pending ARC requests in your community. Here's where they're at, and even data and metrics around how long things are taking to be reviewed and approved, so that you're meeting the expectations that are either in your governing documents or just what the board has said. Hey, we want to approve all these within 10 working days. We can provide the data that shows kind of how are you doing, or how are we doing collectively in that regard. It's also important to listen to resident feedback about the process. Certainly that's what we're doing. Some of the changes we have made and are making are based on resident and board feedback about this process, always looking to automate, make things easier, more streamlined, more consistent, etc. And then ultimately, if your ARC guidelines are outdated or don't serve your community, certainly you have the ability to change them. Now that requires some diligence and homework about your particular governing documents and what's required to make changes. But my point is, I wouldn't be afraid to refresh those as needed, or even make it part of your board journey, maybe every third year or so, to let's take a look at our guidelines. Do they meet the needs of our community? Maybe you've added amenities. Maybe there's different common areas. Maybe there are new things in the community. Maybe you've had an influx of renters and you have some specific issues around homes that are owned by non-occupants, and nuances that you might want to articulate in more detail in your governing documents in that regard. I mentioned Town Square a few times. Hopefully most of you that are community partners, you're well familiar with Town Square, but really looking to leverage the technology that we have available in Town Square. My probably poor analogy is, Town Square is an Associa software platform. I'll call it like a HOA Facebook, but that definitely is an underserving. It does a lot more than sort of what Facebook does, but it's a place where residents can connect and pay their HOA assessments. They can communicate with their community association manager, and more importantly, it's where you can submit an ARC request. And what we found recently was this technology and this capability is available, but not a lot of, or the majority of our community partners were not leveraging this. In some cases, still doing things through email, where residents would literally handwrite a form and then scan it and send it in. shortly moving forward, we're really going to require that Town Square be the only place where you can do an architectural review committee request. And there are lots of reasons why that's beneficial for homeowners, for boards, and for us. Some of which I'll articulate here in case folks are wondering. But number one, the technology is available, so it's not another thing that you have to pay for. In some cases, you're already paying for it as a community, so it just makes sense to leverage it. It makes the process very, very easy. We could probably do a whole separate 20-minute webinar just on Town Square, on the ARC functionality. I didn't want to include that here, but certainly we can. But kind of getting and looking under the hood recently, there's a lot of functionality there that make this process very easy, or easier than filling out a form, in my opinion. The documentation is easy, the tracking is easier. And ultimately, if you're a board member or an ARC committee member, it makes your job reviewing and voting on these much simpler, because the governing documents will be there for you to, take a look at how does this meet up with that. And certainly Kelly, who I mentioned earlier, does a great job of really vetting those to make sure that all the right documents are included. So it doesn't get to the point of the ARC committee or the board reviewing it and they're like, well, hey, everything isn't here, we can't make an informed decision. So she does a great job making sure all the boxes are checked, so that when you do get those to vote on or assess, everything is clear. I think it helps with collaboration, particularly for the ARC committee, if things are in one place where you're not relying on maybe an email thread or a shared drive. Basically, everyone can go to Town Square View, review, vote, etc., and it's all documented. I believe it's going to result in much faster process for everyone involved, and ultimately result in much faster approvals and much higher satisfaction with homeowners on the entire ARC process. Now, some people may push back and say, well, I'm not on Town Square. I don't, I'm maybe a more experienced user or a more, I don't want to say an older person, but we've had some pushback. Well, my community has a lot of older residents and they don't use technology. We hear that, but we're really going to insist that Town Square is the kind of the only way you can get an ARC request reviewed and approved. And I think once people get on and see, they'll see why the advantages way outweigh any maybe minor startups if you're not already on Town Square. But the reality is getting on Town Square is very, very simple. A couple steps to create an account, log in, either download the app or use it on a desktop. And again, I just think it's going to make the entire process easier, faster, more transparent, and ultimately give higher satisfaction for everybody involved. And I know even some of you on this call have experienced this firsthand, of getting requests. Hey, what do I do with these? Like, this should eliminate all of that and make it really, really seamless for you as a board member and for your residents. So I want to give a quick case study.
Hey, Brian. Hey,
yes,
Brian,
sir.
this is Jeff again. You know me, I have to chime in. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So all of that sounded great. What is a timeline for implementing, that kind of closed loop utilization of Town Square? Because in at least my board's experience, we get notification that, there may have been a submittal of an ARC form or a submittal of, some various kind of maybe a maintenance request. We can't even see what it is. And
Yeah,
we can't see what it is, and we can't track it to closure. So what do you
in
think?
full transparency, yeah, we're launching this probably in the next week or two. And what prompted this was really taking a deep dive into the abilities of Town Square and really understanding more myself and our entire team what Town Square can do, particularly the ARC function. So the reality is today was the deadline for Kelly to have all of the communities set up with all the new standard forms, process, etc. So I'll give you just generally maybe within the next week or two, we'll be rolling this out and communicating, here's the new process, here's what it's going to look like, and probably maybe even doing a training or a video on, okay, I'm a homeowner, I'm going to walk through and submit a request step by step. What does it look like? What do the screens look like? What's required? And then maybe a separate training for board members or ARC committee members. What's it going to look like on your end? How are you going to get notified? There's a review in your queue to review. How do you go about looking at the documents, and then how do you vote, yes or no, or things like that. All of that's happening. We've been working on this probably for about a month, but so we're pretty close. So I'll just say within the next week or two, we intend to roll this out to all of our communities. But we want to make sure we don't just say, "Hey, we've made this change. You now got to use Town Square." We want to make sure that we've covered all the bases and provide the training and communication, so that it's not another point of frustration, but like, wow, this is really good. I understand why they made this change. It's really clear how to do it. I understand the process. That's a long answer. Short answer is in the next week or two.
Okay, great. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Brian.
So our case study here, the pergola predicament, in this case, a fictional HOA, Oakview Meadows. Ms. Ramirez submitted an ARC application as you can read, to build this 10 by 12 cedar pergola. She had all the architectural drawings, a photo of a similar structure in another neighborhood. And then the ARC review committee, composed of 3 community volunteers, denied the request, simply citing generically incompatibility with community aesthetics. So you might imagine, if you were Mr. Ramirez, getting a rejection letter that said incompatibility with community aesthetics, like, okay, well, what does that mean specifically? So in looking at the governing documents, it allowed for backyard structures not exceeding 12 feet in height and constructed with materials harmonious to the residents. As you might imagine, the ARC didn't cite any of those specific rules or anything that would really help her understand why it was rejected. In this case, she followed the appeal process to the board, arguing, and I would say rightly so, that the decision was very subjective and lacked due process. Certainly the rejection lacked anything specific that they could point to as to why it was rejected, other than the generic statement that was provided. So as you see, the board revealed it. A board review revealed that 2 of the pergolas had already been approved in the past 12 months, even one larger than the one she had submitted. So the outcome, the board overturned the ARC's decision, approved the project, and instituted mandatory decision documentation guidelines for the ARC moving forward. So a little bit of egg on the face of the ARC committee. Maybe they did the best they could. I'll say this is not an Associate McKay management client, so hopefully our processes and documentation would help avoid this. But I think this is a good case study, and something that might be something you would see in a community where, if you don't have good documentation or process, and you have volunteers who are serving with all the greatest intention of the world, but may not be completely informed or fluent in what the governing documents say, may not have access to the documentation of what other similar requests have been approved in the last 12 months as predicates, or as something they could say, well, hey, we've approved 2 of these that are very, very similar. Why would we reject this one, etc. And then some ARC training and a style guide reference sheet, basically more detail on here's the kind of shed you can have, dimensions, colors, style, materials, etc., to avoid a very similar predicament in the future. Any questions or comments on the case study? Hopefully that gives you an idea of the sort of things that ARC committees or boards could or might encounter. Okay. Some discussion, and maybe these are obvious, but particularly, for boards, if they're watching this after the fact, is maybe some discussion even among yourselves, like, where did the ARC process break down? I don't know if anyone wants to chime in. I'll be quiet and ask if someone wants to talk other than me. In your opinion, where did the ARC process break down? Anyone? Don't be shy. All right, no one wants to talk. I get it.
Well, so I'll chime in. You can always count on me, Brian.
Thank you, Jeff. Yeah.
Well, I would suspect that the ARC members probably didn't understand, the expectations of themselves, nor the requirements of the community, so that they could effectively evaluate and provide feedback to the homeowner. That'd be my feedback.
I think
And
that's pretty common. Yeah.
having previously been on an ARC, I asked from day one, what are my responsibilities? And nobody could really answer that. So
to review ARC requests, and that's probably about all you got. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think hopefully this webinar and other tools and things are helping to prevent that very scenario, where not only for the board, but for the ARC members, it's pretty clear what the roles, responsibilities are, good documentation, etc.
yeah,
I think some of this ties into some of the takeaways that, good documentation and good communication, I think, solve the vast majority of issues related to ARC requests. And then I think in this case, the other advantage that I mentioned of like a platform like Town Square, or having, us or another management company that has the ability to provide data will show me how many more of these type requests we've, processed in the last 12 months, how many have been reviewed and approved, and why were they rejected, et cetera. I think can be very informative, that might make the process much simpler and candidly more defensible if things come to litigation or, things like that, to be able to point to, well, we've had this many reviewed in the last 36 months, and here's all the ones we've approved, here's all the ones we rejected, and why. I think that adds a lot of risk mitigation for boards and communities when you have that level of documentation and process. Any other thoughts on the case study?
I do have another question, Brian.
Yeah.
And this might be a legal question, outside of the purpose of today's discussion, but it really has to do with precedent.
Yeah.
And maybe a previous board didn't take action, or maybe a previous ARC or a previous board approved something that they probably shouldn't have.
Yeah.
And now there's a board in place that is taking a little more ownership, has a little more responsibility, understands expectations a little more. How does all that play together?
I think that is an excellent question. I do think there is probably like an HOA lawyer answer to that. My opinion or input on that is, I think, um, like I've said a couple times, just good documentation is key. Even the point of documenting those historical decisions or precedent or even circumstances, why X ARC got approved 3 years ago when so and so was the board president and he approved his neighbor's ARC request, those sort of thing. I think just having a good rationale and documentation as to what's changed. And I think you can never go wrong if you just point back to the governing documents. Yes, that might have been approved 3 years ago. However, that was candidly not in compliance with our community governing documents. The board that's in place now, we're committed to following and being good fiduciary agents, acting as a board director or as a member of the ARC committee. So we're going to follow our, community bylaws and our CC&Rs. I think that's a pretty, as strong as a defense, or, people may not like the answer, but I think it's hard to argue with the logic. Like, yes, you're just following the rules that maybe should have been followed all along. Now, if you were on the board then and whatever, then maybe it's a little more difficult, but I get the scenario you're saying. Maybe things were done, a little loosey goosey, or maybe it was earlier in the community development when maybe the developer might have been the one reviewing and approving, and they maybe didn't, I don't say they didn't care, but they had less ownership than a homeowner-led board might have now. I don't know if that helps. I guess the main takeaway is just document and point back to the governing documents as much as possible, I think, is the best way to handle that.
Yeah, that's helpful. I
Yeah.
just was unsure that, if previous decisions were kind of set in stone relative to precedents, or, if a defensible position would be, hey, that was likely done in error. I can point you to the governing documents where,
Yeah.
here's the requirement, and that's what, either the ARC or the board or whomever is implementing at this point in time.
Yeah, I think that's good. Or it could be, all right, well, we've done it once or 10 times. Maybe we need to change our ARC rules to accommodate whatever that request is, if it's kind of already become a accepted norm in the neighborhood, if you know what I
Yeah. Okay. All right. Thank you, Brian.
mean. Thank you. All right, with that, we'll wrap up the first section on ARC with a quick summary here. Again, the main thing is to protect your homeowner values, essentially uphold the community governing documents related to these things. I won't list or read the best practice. I think we've covered those in detail and some multiple times. So I think hopefully those are kind of sticking in your brain about best practices related to ARC committees, submissions, and then some of the pitfalls to avoid. Certainly anything that's vague or subjective, as we saw in the case study, what Jeff just brought up, inconsistent precedents, can be problematic. And then ultimately just poor communication, I think, can sour the whole thing. Even with a good process and a good committee and you follow your documents, if you don't communicate or people wait and wait and wait and wait and they don't get, their approval or denial, within a reasonable time frame, I think can spoil all the good work ahead. So I think always got to focus on the communication piece as well. And with that, we're going to pivot to community standards. Oh, I got this here. Community standards enforcement. And some of you may be familiar with this. We recently, I say we, this was sort of, my own idea of like, I really just didn't like the term compliance. Hey, we're going to go do compliance, or when is the compliance drive in our neighborhood? And that's more or less, I think, the generally accepted term in the industry. But I thought, man, there's got to be a better way to express that. So anyway, we came up with this community standards enforcement, and we'll get into in a minute more about that change. So here you see some of the purpose and principles of community standards enforcement. Very similar to the ARC. It's really about preserving community value, but in this case, integrity and fairness of, who gets a violation and who doesn't. And then in some cases to avoid overreach. And in some cases, sort of the negative stereotypes of HOAs or maybe even HOA board members of, the board member that's out, with a ruler measuring, the height of someone's lawn, things like that we've, probably all seen or heard of that we want to avoid. So kind of the HOA tyranny of, someone abusing that power, and then really being in compliance with what legal authority the HOA has, both following, again, the governing documents, as well as any other local and state laws that might apply to this process that involves, as you'll see, eventually, finding a homeowner or placing a lien on their home. So this has different implications than the ARC review. So a little bit about the community standards enforcement versus compliance. I think words shape perception. In my view, the community standards really reflects like, hey, we're just here as your management company partner to help you and the community, whether it's the board or, everyone that's in the community, enforce the standards that you've all agreed upon, essentially when you signed the mortgage or signed, when you bought your home, that you agree to abide by the rules that were set up. So it's really about those shared and mutual expectations, not some arbitrary rules that we make up that we're choosing to enforce. I think sometimes as a management company, we get sort of like, well, you're coming and doing these things to us. We're like, well, no, none of the rules that we're enforcing, we've made up. These are rules that existed in your bylaws or that your board and the community chose to enforce, again, to protect the value of your community. And I think, enforcement is really about, stewardship and mutual accountability versus punishment versus, I think, compliance. I think of like government, like, filing your taxes or things that are more legalistic and really one-sided, like I'm coming to tell you what you're doing wrong, etc. So again, trying to get to a place that's more about mutual accountability, responsibility, and really enforcing or trying to enforce with the board's help the standards that the community has chosen. So really more about enforcing the standards versus control or being punitive in the approach. So a quick analogy to try to put this, like, think of it as like a traffic sign versus a speed trap. So for CSE, it's like having clear signs in your neighborhood, no trespassing or no loitering, or you can't park on the street or whatever the speed limit is. It's very visible. Everyone sees it. It's not arbitrary or subjective as to how it gets applied. And it's really designed to help protect everybody in the community. And again, the community value versus compliance is more about, there's the cop hiding behind the bushes, waiting to zap you going 5 miles over the speed limit, and really more reactive to what's going on and rooted in punishment and more punitive. So anyway, I don't want to beat that too much, but really I think it's important why we chose to change what we offer as a service to community standards enforcement versus compliance. As a side note, I know for those of you that are partners, I sent out one of my emails recently introducing Michael McMaster, who was our new community standards enforcement inspector. He's doing a great job. We also have what I guess affectionately referred to as the Community Standards Enforcement Eggmobile. It's a very small vehicle for a very large man. Michael's a large guy, and he's in this very small Scion, almost like a smart car. So if you see an orange smart car with a large guy in it, that's Michael. We've got a a well-marked vehicle, we're going to get the vehicle wrapped, but it has Associate McKay placards on the side. We even went so far as, he has a little flashing light that goes on the hood when he's out actively doing community standards enforcement. So there's no question about who he is or what he's doing. So a little more detail about what we're offering as Associa. Really, that was a deliberate and calculated investment to really up the game for us in the value and service we provide, and having a dedicated team member. That's all he does 5 days a week is community standards enforcement, investing in a vehicle, and then really, as you can hopefully tell, investing time and attention on all the process behind both ARC reviews and community standards enforcement. So why does this matter? I think we've already covered this. Maybe it's a duplicate slide. So the enforcement framework, similar to the ARC, really about having good process and policy in place. But generally speaking, the ARC of enforcement is Michael or the community association manager is out in a community. They know, number one, what the governing documents say is allowed or not allowed. So they know exactly what they're looking for, what is a quote unquote violation and what's not. So noting that, documenting it with sufficient detail and photographic evidence so that it's indisputable. Yes, this is 123 Smith Lane. Yes, your grass is knee high. Yes, you have a washing machine on your front porch. Whatever it is, there's really indisputable photographic evidence that yes, there is indeed a violation of the community standards, and then referencing the standard so that sort of like the case study of it's not ambiguous. In some cases, maybe something is ambiguous as weeds. Okay, well that doesn't tell me a lot. As what weeds, or grass. So it needs to be very well, at least sufficiently specific, so the homeowner knows what they need to address to bring their home or their property into compliance. So that's sort of step one, is the notice. Hey, this is what we observed on this date, this time. It's in violation of this part of your bylaws or CCNRs, and here's what we recommend you do about it. And then there's some opportunity to cure, or a period of time. Hey, you've got 30 days, or some of this varies a little bit by neighborhood, whether it's 10 working days or 30 days, and depending on the violation, how long they have to fix it. But basically, we're telling you you've got a violation, you've got some period of time to fix it, and then maybe there's a hearing or maybe there's not. Generally speaking, not usually part of most of our communities is any sort of hearing. And then the next step generally is maybe escalating fines, where the first time after you've had the opportunity to cure, you haven't fixed it, there is a fine appended to the homeowner's account, and that really is set by the board or the community, not by Associa, what the fine schedule looks like. The point is that should be well documented, what fines apply when and how, and then ultimately can result in legal action, which is ultimately may result in a lien being filed on the home, which is, if you're not familiar, would prevent the homeowner from selling the home until they satisfy the lien. So that's a general arc of the enforcement framework. Again, the key thing, sort of like the ARC process, is consistent documentation and tracking. Since Michael's been on board, he's done a superb job of really upping our game exponentially in this regard about documenting all the standards for every community in one place. So when he goes out, he knows exactly what he's looking for. I went out with him just last week to several communities, and he literally had the exact covenants for every community before we went, knew exactly what he was looking for. So it wasn't an arbitrary, well, I think this looks like a violation. He knows before he shows up what he's looking for, how he's going to document it, and how he's going to communicate it after the fact.
Yeah.
And then similarly with the ARC thing, yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was just saying, we had our yearly HOA meeting last night, and somebody had seen him and commented that they were very impressed just watching him do his job. They were really impressed. They said they could tell he was being very thorough.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, he is doing a superb job. And yeah, you can tell when someone likes their job. He really, really likes his job and is showing a lot of initiative and professionalism. So thank you. I'll share that feedback with him. But yeah, we're super excited to have Michael, and where we can be even a few months from now with all of our communities, with the Eggmobile patrolling neighborhoods, and him doing a great job documenting things in a really professional way. So thank you for sharing that. Again, similar to the ARC, communication is key. And I think Michael shines here just reading some of the emails. We are working on updating all of our letters that are auto-generated from our system. This is another area of improvement we're making, reviewing all the letters that get sent out to make sure they're just written in the right way with the right tone of voice, even changing the language to community standards, sort of language versus violation, etc. And then avoiding any like blaming or shaming, because let's face it, we all have things. Sometimes you don't know what the rules are, or you just forget, or you're behind for whatever reason. So we want to make it like there's some compassionate enforcement of the standards versus a very legalistic approach, even in the way we communicate. And then really, in case of Michael, he's already demonstrating good acumen at this, really getting educated before he escalates anything. And the same for homeowners, really understanding like before they call or dispute, or I'll just say complain about receiving a community standards enforcement letter, that they really understand like, okay, yeah, I didn't read my bylaws or my community CCNRs, and I'm actually, yes, I am in violation, but I don't think anybody likes getting those letters. But really, homeowners educating themselves as well, and we're adding that language so when they get the letter, it's pretty specific, like, okay, this is in reference to paragraph 2 of section 3, that sort of thing. So it's not just some guy driving around making up stuff to make money. That's not how it works. It's really just enforcing what the communities have said they want to enforce. And then the main a main portion of this is really fairness and consistency, for a lot of reasons. One, preserving community harmony. So, hey, I heard so-and-so got a violation for something, but I didn't. Why is that? And Michael's also been really good at this. It's kind of black or white. There's not a lot of gray area. It's either a violation or an enforcement, standard infraction or not. And then again, avoiding that overreach or any favoritism. Hey, well, you didn't give a violation to a board member or your neighbor, but you gave one to me. And then again, making sure everything is in compliance with all the laws, really to avoid any problems down the road of, and this could be where things could get into a legal situation where the HOA could face litigation because they unfairly enforce the community standards. So a summary slide of 5 steps to fair enforcement. We'll go this in detail. Some of these things we've already talked about. We'll also be including this in some of our communication moving forward, and particularly in any board orientation training. So boards are really crystal clear on what's really key for them to be aware of or think about when it comes to enforcement of community standards. But my hope and belief is with what we've invested in our team, and that we're really handling that for you and keeping you out of hot water, keeping residents happy, and keeping community values as high as possible. Tools and technology. There is, as a town square commercial, there is a town square, I don't know what it's called, if it's town square violations, but it's essentially a new town square app that's just for community standards enforcement, that's in like version 1. I believe when it comes out in like version 2, we'll probably pivot to that, and Michael will use that to document everything, because it's similar to what I found with town square capabilities for ARC. What they've done investment wise to build the right functionality in the town square app for violations is really impressive as well. Lots of functionality. Obviously, it's mobile, easy to download, take pictures, etc. So right now, Michael is using C3. Some of you may have heard C3 is one of our platforms where he's using a mobile version of that, where basically that's where he's documenting the violation that he notes. That's where he's uploading the photos. That's where he's appending the language from the bylaws or CCNRs. And ultimately, C3 is the system that generates the letter that gets sent to a homeowner, whether it's the first letter, hey, we noted this, or the second letter, hey, we've noticed the second time you didn't cure it. Now you're having a fine appended to your account, etc. I mentioned the Eggmobile as well. I consider that part of our technology and tools platform as well. So the second case study here, wrapping up the session on standards enforcement, the holiday lights dispute. Maybe some of you know this neighbor. Hopefully you're not this neighbor, but Mr. Jenkins, a member of Maplewood Grove, left his elaborate Christmas light display up through the end of February. The community standards specify that holiday decorations must be removed within 30 days after the holiday. So that's the scenario. Mr. Jones received his first notice, so sort of what we might call in some vernacular, the friendly letter. Hi, we were in your community. We noticed this infraction on this date. He had a hip surgery, so he asked for a grace period. The HOA manager requested an exemption from the board, but the board did not respond in a timely manner, and a violation fine was issued on February 1st, probably following the documented escalation process that we spoke about earlier. So Mr. Jenkins, obviously not happy, escalated the issue at the next HOA meeting, saying that he felt targeted and that the process lacked compassion and transparency. So the outcome, after the board met, they rescinded the fine due to the mitigating health circumstances, but, reaffirmed with him the importance of timely compliance. And then they revised their protocol to include a 10-day grace period for hardship-based extension requests. I think we see this fairly often. We try, and Michael's, again, done a good job of interacting with board members to really get to the nuance of communities beyond what might be in the governing documents or the CCNRs, circumstances that might exist, whether it's sections of the neighborhood or particular streets of the neighborhood, things like that. And then even in the review process, and this varies by community, who reviews the violations or the community standards enforcement actions before they go out. In some communities, we have directors that they review every single one. And the value of that, it may slow the process down a bit, but the value of that is engaged community directors or board members often will know these details that Michael would not. Mr. Jones just had hip surgery, or he lost his wife and he's not able to do these things, where there is that compassion component where it's not that he's deliberately defying the HOA or not complying, but there are other life or mitigating circumstances that I think help build goodwill and show that, yes, there's an effective process. So the outcomes ultimately, you need to follow the standards, and there is a process that got followed. But ultimately, this was about compassion and having a process that allows for exceptions or hardship-based extensions based on circumstances. So again, brief discussion. We'll open it up. Do you think the HOA was right to issue the fine when they did? And how do you think, I guess as a board member, how do you balance that empathy and enforcement while not being a pushover or, falling victim to excuses, where it's not a legitimate thing? Any thoughts or discussions from anyone?
I think it's very subjective.
Which piece? Like
it
the
would vary so much from one situation to another. It would be real hard to put definitive rules on something like that.
yeah. I don't disagree. I think the key is just like with most of the things we talked about is good documentation, what the mitigating circumstances were and what information the board had when they decided to offer either an extension or to, waive a fine or what have you. As Jeff mentioned, being cognizant of precedents. Well, you waive this fee for Mr. Jenkins or what have you. I think as long as you have good documentation and I would say apply good common sense is really important as well. Any other thoughts on this case study? Hopefully it's at least got you thinking.
I think Kathy was spot on. It's very subjective. And I think, something you said about having a board member, review it before it goes out for a potential fine. I think that should be considered a best practice and one we'll take under advisement, because we're a small community, and again, to your second point, you have to balance empathy with enforcement, and all families and individuals go through issues over time, and we want to work with them. This isn't really about enforcement day to day. It's about enforcement over the long haul. And if somebody has difficulty now, and we can help them with that, then we should be planning to do that.
Sure.
That's my thought.
Thank you. Yeah. Anyone else? I know we're a little bit over time here, right at the hour. So, okay. Well, brief community standards enforcement summary and takeaways, very similar to the ARC things, clear rules, consistent application, respectful, professional, timely communication. And then some of the best practices I think that we have seen or are working to ensure that we apply consistently, routine inspections, not necessarily the same day and time every month, but regular inspections. So you don't go, multiple months with no enforcement. So I think we're working on that. And one of the reasons why we hired Michael. And then documentation around the notice period, people have time to cure the whatever violation is noted, and then good documentation all around. And then really just thinking through that fair enforcement model that I showed earlier. I think some of the things here, the main risk to avoid, the big area is the selective enforcement without good documentation or rationale, I think is the huge pitfall or potential risk acceleration if you're just being inconsistent in how you're applying your community standards can be very problematic down the line. And then again, the communication, and then not being empathetic or handling homeowner feedback around the process or the submission. I think those are all things hopefully you've seen or heard we're working to mitigate or address through process and policy and good communication. And then as far as the wrap up and Q&A session, I know we're about over time, so I'll definitely stay on as long as there are questions or folks have things they want to talk about. But I'll just say, does anyone have any open questions or thoughts about the ARC process or community standards enforcement, or anything they want to share that, hey, this was really insightful, I'm going to take away with my board or in my role as a board director that might be helpful for someone else to hear? Anyone have anything they want to share?
Well, I'd just like to say I really appreciate that you hired Michael for compliance because, as a board member, these are our neighbors that we live with. So I've never dealt with compliance. I've always made it very clear. No, I don't want to do compliance. It's very difficult to do things like that with your neighbors. So just, if anybody ever complains, you can say, oh, the board doesn't do that. That's not us. So I'm really grateful for that.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. I think most of you, if you're a current partner, you have our contact information. I'll just point out, I do this in every webinar, the main number there, the 205-6700. I want to make sure everyone understands, if you're watching this, that's our 24-hour, in my vernacular, our 24-hour customer service phone number. That's the customer call center that's in Dallas, Texas. That's not ringing to our office in Birmingham. We've tried to really push out individual extensions for community managers, for myself, for our entire leadership team. So really encourage you to call those numbers first. And then if you have an emergency, we say fire, blood, or emergency, meaning like, okay, you've got a water main that's busted or a electricity line that's down or something major, and it's after hours, call the customer service number. But for routine things, we really want to make it more local and personal, unless it's something routine, like I just need to know what my account number is or things like that. But just want to reiterate that for this webinar as well. The email that goes to our back office as well, and then our online presence as well as our LinkedIn profile. With that, I just say thank you for those of you that showed up, take the time to learn and grow and benefit of your community, your board, and your neighbors. I certainly know, and you probably all can vouch for this, that being on a board in HOA isn't easy, and generally is a thankless volunteer role that you're really serving the greater good of the community. So thank you for that. But I think when we lead with fairness and listen with empathy, and we all act with integrity and we communicate clearly, we can elevate the entire community that we live in. So also just want to say, if you have other questions that come up from this webinar, by all means, reach out to myself or anyone on our entire team. We're happy to help at any time, because we're really trying to just keep raising the standard together in community standard enforcement, ARC, and HOA governance in general. So with that, I'll bid you adieu unless there's final comments or questions.
Thank you, Brian. Great job, and we really appreciate what you're doing.
Thank you all very much.
Yes,
have a great evening.
Thank you. I second that. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.